Ken has been CEO of NPR for about 11 months now. He has been with NPR for 8 years, came in '99, and has had some remarkable achievements. I believe that the listenership of NPR has doubled in your tenure there, and I think each one of you are a significant part of that. And if you haven't, please tell your friends, and let's see if we can double it yet again sometime soon. But Ken is very, very gracious to take the amount of time that he's been able to spend with us here. He has a very special event coming up in his life. As the father, I have to tell you, public radio and public television are pretty wonderful things, but kids are the best ever. And Ken and his wife, in about 5 weeks, are about to welcome the first youngster into their family. So we're very good.
Thank you, John. And we've already signed him up for membership in WAMU in Washington. As John mentioned, and thank you for that introduction, John, I've been a CEO at NPR for about 11 months, and probably the best, most fun, most rewarding thing I do is go from community to community, visiting stations. I've never failed to be impressed by the professionalism and the dedication of my colleagues at public radio stations around the country. This year I've been from Bethel, Alaska to Miami, Florida. But I have to say, even though each and every one of those stops is special, I think the welcome that I've gotten from the folks at WABE has been the warmest embrace that I've had during this year. I really want to thank John and all his colleagues for making me, Dana, and Annie feel so much at home here in Atlanta. And I want to thank all of you as well. Public radio is an extraordinary thing. We give our content away for free and ask people to support it voluntarily. It's almost the most anti-free market policies that I can think of. But we wouldn't exist without the support of millions of listeners across the country. Listener support is the most important source of support for public radio, for WABE, and for NPR. And I want to thank you for your support of WABE, because by your voluntary support, you make what WABE possible, and you make NPR possible. So thank you for that. Without it, I wouldn't have a job, and my 800 colleagues at NPR wouldn't be able to do the reporting that you and the community of Atlanta and communities around the country rely on. The thing that I like to do when I come out to visit with folks is really talk, to have a conversation, to hear your questions, to hear your ideas. But let me give a few introductory remarks, largely as a warm-up. Let me first tell you a little bit about the history of NPR, because it's a linear story that has brought us to a very different place. When NPR went on the air in April of 1971, our first show was All Things Considered. And if I could digress for a moment, one of the great things about working at NPR is the fact that the people who were in the studio that first day, many of them are still at NPR. Susan Stamberg was the host. Linda Wertheimer was the director. And they're still here 35 years later, building the NPR of the future alongside people who weren't even born at the time. And that mix of the great legacy of public broadcasting, the new energy of the future of public broadcasting is really the thing that keeps, I think, NPR vital and growing every day. But when we went on the air with All Things Considered, we were considered to be an alternative. At the time that we were on the air, there were many major broadcast news organizations that really brought in news reports from around the world. And I think most clearly of CBS News, the Tiffany Network, the network of Edward R. Murrow, of Walter Cronkite, which really defined the standards of broadcast journalism at the time. We were just intended to be an alternative to them. And let me read to you a quote to describe what it was like to be at an alternative like NPR a generation ago. It's a quote from John Burnett's latest book. John Burnett, who is our Austin-based reporter, and one of, I think, in addition to being the tallest reporter at NPR, he's about 6'8". I think he's perhaps one of our finest reporters. He's covered wars across Central America. He's covered politics across the Southeast. He's covered Katrina and Rita and virtually every major event that has happened in the southern United States over the last 20 years. He started in NPR in 1986. And this is what it was like. When I joined NPR in 1986, we were essentially a supplemental news source. Though we covered the news of the day, we were best known for the breath-by-breath account of a trek up Everest, more than anyone wanted to know about maple sugaring, hammered dulcimers, and clown colleges. In those days, I often explained to people who we were. It's the radio side of PBS. Think of the BBC for America. One night I was at Fort Worth Rodeo Arena recording a bull rider when they announced over the PA system, "We want to welcome National Public Rodeo." The cowboy crowd in hats and boots whooped in delight, believing Washington had finally funded something they cared about. But a funny thing happened on the way to being an alternative. The world changed. The economics of journalism changed. And the commercial world has taken a serious step back from fact-based, contextual reporting from around the world. When we opened up our first foreign bureau in 1982 in London, at Bush House at the BBC, Robert Siegel, who you know as the great host of All Things Considered, was actually our first foreign correspondent. And that was our first foreign bureau 25 years ago. At the time, CBS News had 18 foreign bureaus. Today, CBS News has 2, and last year we opened up our 18th foreign bureau in Kabul. The Baltimore Sun, the Boston Globe both closed their last foreign bureaus last year. And I used to tell people when I gave the speech that 1,000 newsroom jobs are lost every year. I can't tell you that anymore because 1,000 newsroom jobs have been lost since April. There's a crisis in American journalism, and we have accepted it as our institutional mission at NPR to step into that void, to be the broadcaster of record for this country, to cover events around the world, to provide balanced fact-based reporting, the context, the depth, the human narrative behind the story from around the world. And a funny thing has happened with that. John stole my punchline a bit. But we have grown as every other media organization in this country has been fragmented and lost audiences, as newspapership reading has been going down for a generation. NPR and public radio's audience has grown. When Robert Siegel showed up at Bush House in London in 1982, the weekly listenership for NPR was about 2 million. When I showed up at NPR in 1999, our audience was about 13 million. And today, when the spring, or I think probably in about a month when our spring book comes out, it's going to show an audience of about 27 million. And to me, that really reflects the investments that NPR and WABE and public radio stations have made in journalism, in cultural offerings, in the finest of music productions, and in that relationship of trust, belonging, and community with listeners around the country. It's been an extraordinary journey. And I think it has been repaid off in terms of service for the country. I think there are challenges, and one of the things I think to think about are some of the challenges in the middle of probably the largest media revolution in history. The way people engaging with content is changing every day. You open up the newspaper and you read about iPods or iPhones or mobile phones or satellite radio or HD radio. All of which are changing how people are engaging with audio every day. This summer, when we had our interns in for a lunch at NPR. And our interns are highly self-selected people. They're there because they value NPR, they value public radio, they have relationships with their local public radio institutions. And we asked them, how many of you own radios? And the answer was 0. All of them engage with public radio through the internet or through satellite radio, through their cell phones. And the challenge really is for organizations like NPR and WABE, the strategic challenge, how to keep up this great journalism, how to invest in journalism, how to keep the best radio shows going, but also to evolve as institutions and be ready for the next generation when they start looking for our shared content together in new places and new spaces. And that's really sort of the thing that I'm most energized about. Think about those challenges, to come talk with John and his colleagues about how they're thinking about them, and to figure out the way that NPR and public radio together is going to be stronger and more important tomorrow than it is today. We also have, and the thing I most love talking about is actually what our reporters are doing. And I want to tell you about a few of the stories we're really thinking about for the next year. We're in the midst of, I think, just sort of an extraordinary cycle of news. We've invested heavily in content overseas. I want to talk a little bit about our foreign coverage and then some of the stories we're thinking about domestically. Overseas, as you know, we have 18, as I mentioned earlier, we have 18 foreign bureaus. There are two particular stories that we're actually going to follow next year that I want to tell you about. One is two of our foreign bureaus are in China. Two reporters for 1.3 billion people. But the impact of the story we're actually most interested in next year is not just the impact of China in China, but the impact of China around the world. So we're going to launch a series called China in the World, which is really going to draw on our reporters from every single bureau. Talk about how China is affecting business in Africa, geopolitics in Latin America, business trends in the U.S., environmental trends around the world. And we're going to draw on these 18 foreign bureaus to try to tell that story from around the world. We're also launching a Great River series. Going back to China, we sent Rob Gifford, if you remember, his China Road series, which is now a book. We sent him to, he basically hitchhiked, took buses, taxis, about 3,000 miles across China across Route 320. And it was a series of road trips, stories he did. But they weren't really about Route 320. They were about the changing culture of a changing country through the lens of this particular highway. Environmental changes, business changes, political changes, cultural changes, demographic changes as people move from rural societies to urban societies. And we found, and we later did the same thing in India when we sent Phil Reeves down the Ganges. And this was a device, a fulcrum for telling the stories of changing cultures and changing societies that we found to be extremely powerful. So we've committed this year to really sending all of our reporters down the great rivers of the world, not to tell the story of a river, but to tell the story of a changing world through the lens of this river. And we're really excited about that because what NPR does, I think, and what WABE does better than anyone else is not just report the facts. We do that. I think we do that extraordinarily well. But the best NPR stories, reporters are born storytellers. They tell the stories of changing societies. They tell the stories of people. Embedded in NPR is the belief that in every person there is a story. And that's reflected in things like StoryCorps and This I Believe that I think are really some of the finest reporting and storytelling that NPR does. And of course, we're going to continue to tell what's going on in the Middle East, in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, areas that others have abandoned. And of course, we'll tell the critical story from Iraq. I do want to digress and tell the story of our reporters in Iraq. I went to Iraq in April. And I spent all of 72 hours there. And I went there for a very specific reason. I know we send about 20 American reporters, producers, and editors through Iraq each year. And I'm able to meet them and talk to them in the comfort of my own office back in Washington, D.C. But our eyes and ears in Iraq these days are those 20 reporters, producers, and editors, but it's also about 15 Iraqi employees of NPR who every day face extraordinary dangers to work for a Western news organization. They can't even tell their families what they do. But they have come over a period of 5 years, our frontline reporters, our journalists of record, because they can get out into the corners of Baghdad and the corners of Iraq that our reporters, our American reporters can't. And they don't have the luxury of coming to my nice office in Washington, D.C. So I had to go there to meet them and to thank them for their contributions to NPR and to public radio. Because the stories they've told, along with Annie Garrels and Jamie Tarabay, I think have been powerful records of what's been going on in Iraq. I do want to convey to you, though, if I could tell a little bit of a sort of an observation from the time I was in Iraq. We all know how dangerous it is for reporters there. We can all envision that. More reporters have been killed in Iraq this past year, since the conflict began, than any other conflict in sort of the history of journalism. We all know how hard people work, the trying nature of the story. But I'll tell you one thing I didn't actually appreciate till I got there, was just how sort of intense the work was. We have a 6-week rotation in Iraq. That was set by our foreign editor, Lauren Jenkins. Lauren Jenkins is one of these great characters who seems stamped out a movie. You're not allowed to smoke in NPR, but if you could, he'd be chomping on a cigar, sort of, bellowing at his reporters. He won a Pulitzer Prize for covering the Middle East when he was at the Washington Post. He covered Vietnam. He's been in every war zone in the last 30 years. So when Lauren says, people should only go for 6 weeks, I believe him. But I didn't really understand him. I accepted it as the case that 6 weeks is the length someone can cover it before they have to go out, take a breather before they go back in. But when I got there and I just saw sort of the intensity of work, you're on 24 hours a day. You're filing for Morning Edition. You're filing for All Things Considered. You're filing for newscasts, often which is in the middle of the night, Iraq time. There's no place to retreat to. You're either there's nothing else to talk about. There's nothing else to do. It's 24 hours a day under the most stressful conditions. And when I saw it, I immediately understood what Lauren had talked about. And I'll tell you a little vignette that sort of captured the dedication of people like Annie Garrels and Jamie Tarabay and Tom Bowman. I was there with Lauren, and he was chomping on a cigar. There's no such rule against smoking in Baghdad. And Annie Garrels and Tom Bowman and Tom Bullock, who's Annie's producer, were finishing up a 6-week string. Tom had been out with the Marines in Fallujah, and Annie had been manning the bureau. Tom had been manning the bureau in Baghdad. And a new team was coming in to take over, and then we were, all 5 of us, the 3 who'd been there for 6 weeks, me and Lauren, were going out to a meeting in Damascus together. They had been, at 10 o'clock on the last night, sort of a formal handover took place. Tom and Annie and Tom sort of turned the computers over, and that's sort of the formal handoff for reporters. They turned the computers and the reporters over to the new team, and they knew they were on their way out. And Tom, not Annie, I'm happy to report, had been saving up sort of their victory cigar, their exit line, because they have a DVD player there. And they had been saving up and obviously been giggling about it for 6 weeks. The worst movie they could think of, Snakes on a Plane. And it was obvious that they had been talking about it. When they popped Snakes in a Plane into the DVD player, that was the moment they knew they were released from Baghdad and they'd be able to escape. So at about 10:15 that evening, drinks in hand, obviously some relief etched on their face. They popped in Snakes on a Plane. And we all sat down and watched this movie, which I do not recommend to any thinking, breathing human being. But they had a great time. They were having a great time until about 10:30 when the artillery started. And what began then was one of the longest sustained bombardments from the Americans, going out actually from the Green Zone and from Camp Victory into other parts of Baghdad. And at 10:31, Tom and Annie were back on the clock. And they were up even after the handoff till 2 a.m. filing on the ATC, All Things Considered. I went to bed, but they kept reporting. And in Baghdad, you're never off the clock, no matter what handoff you've made. And the next day, after we drove out to the airport through 6 full body searches, we got off the plane. We took the corkscrew exit from the Baghdad airport. I've actually never seen I've never seen people fall asleep so quickly. You could actually watch the physical release of tension from their body. I mean, it was really the most amazing sight. And to me, it sort of captured the dedication of people because they left and I left. I ain't going back. But they turn around and go back every 6 weeks, year after year, a month after month, week after week. And that's sort of the dedication of these reporters, I think, that really inspires me. And I think is inspirational to all the 26 million listeners of NPR. We're, of course, going to cover a number of domestic stories, although the difference between domestic and international stories, I think, changes a lot in this day and age. We're going to invest heavily in election 08, which we begin to think of now as probably the beginning of election 12. This is the longest, most complicated, most highly contested election of my lifetime. The first election since the 30s in which no sitting president or vice president has been in play. Both houses of Congress, the presidency, probably the Supreme Court, many state houses up for grabs. And we're going to make sure that we cover every candidate and the horse race as closely as possible. But what's going to distinguish NPR is not the horse race, because everyone covers the horse race. It's trying to get at the issues that voters care about. So we're going to have Julie Rovner covering healthcare issues across all candidates. John Instey on economics across all candidates. Our best reporters trying to get at the issues that matter most to voters. And that's why our coverage is going to be titled What Really Matters. And that's going to be on air online. It's going to be from NPR. It's going to be in partnership with our great member stations. We're going to cover the issues that matter most to their local communities. And I'm very excited about what we can contribute leading up to 08, but not ending in 08, because this election is also about accountability and thinking with voters on air again and online about whether the candidates' promises, as fulsome as they are, will candidates be held accountable for that once they take office. And the other coverage I want to mention is our investment, our partnership with National Geographic called Climate Connections, a worldwide enterprise that we've undertaken for 18 months to tell the stories from around the globe, not of whether climate change exists or not. We accept that it does, but how communities around the world, how cultures around the world, how civilizations around the world are adapting to the largest climate change in a millennium. So we've been reporting from the Amazon basin to sinking islands in the South Pacific, to the Tuaregs of North Africa. How are they adapting to the changed environment that are affecting their livelihoods, their ways of lives? And those are the types of stories I think are really only NPR can tell, only public radio can tell, because we've made those commitments to reporting, to journalism, and to human narrative, and to the full arc of human narrative that I think is so essential to our civil society today. We tell these stories, and I'll tell one last story, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. We tell these stories not because not just because facts are important. They are, but because we think we're giving people the tools to be better citizens. Because NPR's service doesn't begin and end when you hear it on the radio. It's what you do with it. It's what you talk about with your family and your friends. I actually think of NPR's audience not as just 27 million listeners, but the hundreds of millions of people who hear the results of our efforts. Because we know that people take what we do and talk about it with their friends, their families. They take public action. The characteristic of the NPR audience, the WABE audience, is activity. Twice as likely to vote, 3 times as likely to write their congressman, 4 times as likely to write a letter to the editor. And we believe we give tools to make people better members of their community, better citizens of this country. And I'll tell you one story that exemplifies that for me. In 2005, November 2005, All Things Considered did a 3-part story on what the Department of Agriculture calls. I can't tell the story because I pulled the wrong piece of paper. I can tell the story because I have the right piece of paper. On what the Department of Agriculture, one of these great bureaucratic phrases, calls the food insecure. That's 38 million Americans who every day have to make choices between the necessities of life, fully feeding their family, housing, clothing, medicine, health care. Most of those people who are qualified or classified as food insecure are people who are above the poverty line but don't qualify for the full range of government support services. 38 million Americans. So at Thanksgiving 2005, we told several stories from across the country of families that fell into this category. And one of the stories we told was about a family in West Virginia, a family who fell into this food insecure category. The husband worked full-time, the wife worked part-time, but their joint income was not sufficient to fully feed their family, especially at that holiday time, to pay for their full rent, to cover health care costs, and the other necessities of life. And we described the story of a family often making choices between fully feeding the parents and the children, between health care for the mother who was a diabetic, and all the clothes that the children needed, and a family whose wife had sold the family heirloom china in order to get some money to feed the family. And the outpouring of response from our listeners was extraordinary. Thousands of emails, hundreds of checks. We know what to do with checks at NPR. We like checks, but we're used to having checks written to NPR or to a local public radio station. First time we'd ever gotten checks that were written that were intended for food banks. We actually had to figure out how to handle and how to get the resources into the hands of people who knew what to do with it. And some of the emails talked about what people were going to do in their local communities to support people who fell into this category. And I want to read one of them to you. Here it is. I'm passionately interested in assisting the family in West Virginia by organizing some groceries, as well as finding Blue Willow china. to replace the great-great-great-grandmother's set the mother sold for $50. I would also like to financially support the home delivery of food to the food insecure that was featured. I sat in my car sobbing as I listened to your story. Have told anyone and everyone I have come across about it. Featured in my Thanksgiving remembrances, a family tradition we have each year at our abundant table. It would mean a great deal for me to help this family. I've listened to NPR since I was a small child and have never reached out before. Thank you so much, Ashley Judd. And I use that email not because I like reading emails from celebrities, though I do. I do it because, to me, it exemplified the power of journalism, the power of storytelling. It's not an art form merely for the sake, it's not reporting for the sake of reporting. It's for giving tools for people to be better citizens, to be better members of the community, and that's, I think, what brings us to work every day at NPR. We couldn't do that. We wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to pay for the reporters, pay their salary, give armored cars for our reporters in Iraq, have the new technologies necessary to reach the next generation of listeners without your support. Again, public support, voluntary support is the engine that drives public radio. It drives NPR, it drives WABE, and I want to tell you how grateful I am to each and every one of you for supporting WABE here in Atlanta. Thank you so much. So questions, thoughts, ideas? Yes, sir.
Do you have an initiative to get to the immigrant population in the country with those topics you were talking about?
You know, you mean in terms of them being listeners of
Sure.
NPR? Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and we spent a lot of time thinking about how to really put the national in the end of NPR. And truthfully, I think the hard part to think about is we have a particular style, a particular demographic. I love our audiences, but it's of a type. It doesn't reflect the country as a whole. And one of the challenges and actually one of the opportunities of new technology is thinking about how to reach new audiences. Because when you're a radio station, this is one of the choices that John and Milton and Carrie and the entire team here at WABE faces, you can only serve one audience. You only have one radio signal. And it's a segmented medium, and you don't switch between segments lightly. I think new technologies really give us an opportunity to reach new audiences. NPR started in podcasting. We have 3 Spanish-language podcasts now. We think about doing content in other languages now for the first time, because now we have a means of distribution. We've created new shows aimed at different demographics of the audience. I would mention 2 shows, one called News and Notes from L.A., one called Tell Me More, hosted by Michelle Martin from D.C., and we have our first show aimed at younger audiences. So we're really thinking very hard about how we can reach new audiences and bring them into the family of public radio. Yes?
I was up in Vermont this summer, and I noticed that there was an all-classical public radio. The thing I like best about public radio is it binds us together, all 26 million.
Yes.
And my fear is if you reacted to direct radio, that if you have an all Lois Reitz's station and an all news station, that the thing that binds us together again will fragment out. Is that a worry that if you begin reacting and having all classical and all talk and all something else, to somehow loosen the very greatness of it?
No, I don't think so. And I'll tell you a couple. And each, the challenge here is different than the challenge in Vermont. And one of the great things about public radio, one of the unique things about public radio in this time of consolidation, commercial consolidation, is that every public radio station is locally owned, locally controlled. John and his colleagues decide what goes on WABE, not me. I'm here to support their programming decisions, not argue with them. And that's the nature of the dialogue. The needs of the Atlanta community might very well be different from the needs of the Vermont community, which it might be very well different from the needs of the Washington, D.C. or the San Francisco community. And that's a real core strength of public radio. And every public, to that, every public radio station is a little bit different. Vermont Public Radio happens to have an all-classical station and an all-news station. There is a lot of strength, I will tell you, and public radio has grown a lot because of format focusing and creating an all-news stream. The opportunity to create an all-news stream and all-classical stream is a luxury, I think, that is very valuable for the citizens of Vermont. They have more choice, more ability to engage in public radio, but it's very different from community to community. Some cities have one station, some cities have 3 stations, and that drives different choices, and that is also driven by what else is available from commercial broadcasters. So I think, to circle around, I don't worry at all about format focusing like that. I'm focused on making sure that NPR creates the best programming so that John and Kerry and his colleagues can make the best programming choices for the citizens of Atlanta. You have a question?
We occasionally hear that some powerful politicians are unhappy with NPR. How do you deal with that?
I'm enthusiastic when powerful groups of politicians are unhappy with NPR because it means we're doing our job. Of course, NPR and public radio, public broadcasting really is in a unique position because while mentioning again that listener support is the largest source of support, federal support is still an important source of support for public broadcasting. I will tell you it's not as important source of support for NPR. We don't get any money from the federal government, but it's important because it's an important source of support for our public radio stations around the country. It provides about $100 million in revenue for stations, and it's most important to the stations that have the least, rural stations, minority stations. So I'm a big advocate for government support of NPR. And there are from time to time dust-ups about federal funding. And the interesting thing is that despite the dust-ups, at least in my memory, federal support for public broadcasting has never gone down. It's been flat for about 8 years. But has never gone down. And the last time members of the House of Representatives tried to suggest cutting federal funding for public broadcasting by about 30%, about 2 million listeners from around the country wrote, called, emailed their members of Congress. That's 2 million voters, because that's the characteristics, the participating characteristics of public broadcasting listeners. And if there's anything people on the Hill respect, is the power of 2 million voters. I think their message was support public broadcasting, keep your hands off of public broadcasting. Don't get involved in the editorial matters of public broadcasting. I think it's a very powerful message. So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about getting on the wrong side of powerful members of Congress. I also think we're in a good position now. For the first time since I've been in NPR, the conversation with members of Congress is not about don't cut public broadcasting, keep our funding level. It's the first time we can talk about here's what we can do with more federal support. Here's what WABE can do. Here's what stations in Alaska and Hawaii and California and Vermont can do with more resources. And that's a good conversation to have than the other way around. So I'm actually quite, it is subject to who controls Congress, who are the key members of Congress. It's not all about Republicans and Democrats. Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, as a Republican senator as you can, is probably the single biggest advocate in the history of public broadcasting, because he knows without public radio and public television, there would be no services to most of Alaska. So it's not an R&D issue, but it is a good time for us to actually be talking about increased federal support, which I think is well justified and well earned for public broadcasting now.
I'll ask another question.
Okay, good. And the gentleman next to you after that.
The fitness of the young people of the country and the obesity problem. We were talking about nutrition in one of the areas.
It's interesting you ask that because NPR did a whole series of stories about obesity earlier. I think it was earlier this week. And I think that's one of the interesting issues that we're following this year. And again, it's not just simply about reports and what they say. It's thinking about what is the impact of obesity on healthcare, on what people do with their time, how involved they are in sports in their communities. I mean, things like issues of health and participation, I think, are very important to thinking about what the future looks like. I think there are a lot of things that are driving different trends in weight, and different trends in eating habits, different trends in who's coming to this country and their cultures. I will say that one of the great things that we have are remarkable reporters like Julie Rovner, who understand healthcare, the healthcare system, and other reporters scattered around the country. One of the great advantages that we have actually at NPR is that it's not just about NPR reporters. It is about reporters at hundreds of stations who know about things going on in their communities. So sitting back there, of course, is Michael Fields, head of the ABE newsroom. But we really think of him as part of the sort of the news network of NPR, because he can tell stories about healthcare here in Atlanta that are relevant to and have them as part of the NPR offering, because it's relevant to the country as a whole. So I think that story is like many stories that we're covering, trying to tell it from a whole number of different angles, not just the science angle, not just the healthcare angle, but the human angle as well.
Well, it's very paradoxical, folks not having enough to eat, yet many of them are obese with diabetes, and then the baby boom of population coming on, and with diabetes on the rise, it's going to be really a problem furnishing healthcare in the country.
Well, it's a very interesting thing, and I'll go outside what I actually know about. I mean, I think that some of the interesting dynamics is that because of sort of the food insecure, people often choose the cheapest food available, which is often the fast foods, and therefore the most unhealthy and most highly caloric. I'm now talking well outside my expertise, but I think that's some of the things we've talked about is, in fact, that dynamic. Yes, sir.
Your comments were so substantially directed toward your news coverage,
Yeah.
and I applaud that very enthusiastically, because I not only think it's tremendously important, but I think that your network does an absolutely superb and consummate job, and I think it's laudable that I say we because I am a director here, have been busily opening bureaus when everyone else is closing them.
Yes.
But you didn't mention anything on the arts, and I'm wondering where within the mosaic, the geometry of NPR, how could you categorize or how could you comment on any interest in the arts? What percentage of importance would you assign to that in a broad categorical way, not just music, but visual arts or performing arts, arts of any sort?
It's a great question, and I think your question about NPR's participation in the arts, music, movies, books, the visual arts, it really exposes sort of the limitation of my language. Because when I talk about news, I'm talking about the full scope of the human experience as reflected in shows like More and District and All Things Considered. Every NPR show covers music. Every NPR show covers books. Every NPR show covers the visual arts. Every NPR show, fail none, covers movies. We think a lot about culture and we think of, even though actually NPR doesn't produce anything called a music show, we distribute some really wonderful music shows, jazz shows, classical shows. We have 5 full 24-hour streams of music. But we don't produce anything because we've discovered that what NPR can do that others can't. Others can produce the most wonderful music programs. What NPR can do is cover music and educate music. I think of NPR as really the largest educational institution in this country, 27 million people who are matriculate with us every week. But we cover the music. We educate people about music. People make music discoveries and music decisions based upon what they hear in our shows, and that same goes for books. NPR sells more books than Oprah does because people hear what Terry Gross is reporting on Fresh Air. They hear what Scott Simon and Robert Siegel's doing in their series on books you must read. So we're very much dedicated to covering, engaging in culture and the arts. The other thing I want to mention, because it's actually very near and dear to my heart, is actually thinking about how public radio engages in these topics in the digital age. And though NPR itself, one of the challenges we face is in a system of 300 stations, many of them producing some of the most remarkable music programming, interviews, performances, live concerts, selections by trusted hosts, ideas from trusted hosts. You can't find that in the digital world. You can if you happen to be in the broadcast signal, or you can find it if you happen to be like me, a public radio junkie who knows the web address of every single public radio station in the country. But otherwise, you can't find it. And we're launching in October a new I don't know what to call it, music super site, which actually collects the music content from NPR programming and in the first phase from 12 launch partners from around the country. KPLU in Seattle, WXPN in Philadelphia, WGBH, a classical station in Boston, Folk Alley in Ohio, and help people give people the opportunity to discover this remarkable cultural archive that around the country. So we're really, in a different way, in a way that's different than 5 years ago, really deeply and probably more invested in music and the arts and cultural presentations than ever before. Yes, sir.
Ken, in your 11 months as head of NPR, has there been any change in broadcast policy? And the second phase of that question is, what and who drives the policy, the broadcast policy for NPR?
Well,
you indicated you didn't. You said the powerful politicians don't.
Yeah.
But you did not say who did or does.
So if you mean by broadcast policy, and I think you do, but correct me if I'm wrong, if you mean who is sitting there making decisions about what goes on every day on the news magazines, what editorial choices are made, what stories are selected, who assures the balance and objectivity of our reporting. If that's what you mean, that's close, good. And then you can bring it closer. That is a function that is specifically dedicated, not to me, but to the NPR newsroom. There are about 500 people. It's headed by a vice president for news who's a professional journalist. They are responsible. Every story before it goes on the air at NPR is edited, sometimes once, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times by different editors. No story goes on. It's very much organized like a newspaper newsroom. There's a national desk, there's a foreign desk, there's a science desk. Those desks and the editors of them have the final calls on the editorial policies of NPR.
Let me just take it a step further.
Okay.
These folk are influenced by somebody, and I want to know if you know who influences them and their decisions. Would it be the affiliates out here? Would it be the contributors, financial contributors?
Yes.
Who?
I think everyone's influenced by people. They don't sit in isolation. I think they're influenced by others in the editorial community. They see what the New York Times are doing or the Washington Post is doing. I think that's influential in their discourse. I think they're influenced by the feedback they get from listeners. Hundreds of thousands of emails, often by experts in the field. I think that's influential. I'll tell you that who they're not influenced by. They're not terribly influenced by me. They're certainly not influenced by financial considerations. I've always said that if I ever went down to the NPR newsroom and asked them to change something because, or report on something because of financial consideration, they would be happy to throw me out the front door of NPR. And I think the deeply embedded in the DNA of NPR is editorial independence, making the best editorial judgments independent of any influence. And there's a reason. There's actually a good business reason for that. I don't want to sound Pollyannish. I do know and trust in the independence of the NPR newsroom. But there's a good business reason, and that is the most important value from a financial, from a business, from a journalism perspective, from any perspective that matters to us, is the relationship of trust we have with listeners. If our listeners thought that our newsroom was making editorial judgments based upon non-editorial reasons, our relationship of trust, our economics of listener support would go away. So if no other reasons than out of sort of pure greed for the revenues of NPR and member stations, it's in our interest to make sure that there's a strong firewall between NPR News and any outside financial or political influence. And I've been in NPR for 8 years. There is nothing I believe in more than the existence and the strength of that firewall.
So listeners is one influence.
What's that?
Listeners. Are you saying listeners are significant influence?
Well, I think listeners write to us. I think we always listen. I think that is correct. Listeners, 27 million, are often commenting to us, giving their views, often sometimes correcting us. You can hear listener letters on our air. Often they're right about facts, about specifics. So I think they are influence. Professionals are influence. But I think in the end, the thing that influences the ultimate decision is based upon the editorial judgments of the editors in the newsroom and their expertise in the areas they cover.
I hate to cut everybody off, but
we
need to let Ken eat.
Okay.
And he has an interview after that. But if we could finish with Mr. Goldstein, you have one question.
Yes, sir.
I can tell you my experience. I broke my leg over a year ago, and I've been sort of confined to my apartment, and it's wired with every room. And I have nurses, guardians, or whatever you want to call them. They come in 24 hours a day, and they've been introduced to this station. They ask me, how do you get this station? Do you have to pay for it? Does anybody listen to it? They have to find out how to do it. Tune in at home. They've never been exposed to it for any length of time.
Yep.
And being relieved of all the murders and the car crashes and ads, and just hear this, and to hear Lois Reitz's voice. They're all interested in classical music now.
It's a fantastic story. Thank you. I will say thank you for that wonderful story. And one of the things we actually rely on listeners for, both at NPR and WABE, we build a lot of our competitors or other media organizations have large marketing budgets. We don't. We really build listeners one listener at a time, and we really count on you all, not just for your financial support, not just for your advocacy and emotional and strategic support. We also count on all of you to spread the word of NPR and WABE, and I want to thank you all for that whole range of support of these great institutions. Thank you so much. Listening to